Hi everyone, I hope you're well. So, today I wanted to mention some of the books that I have read that have the lowest ratings on Goodreads, the lowest average ratings. So, of course, not my ratings, but the general consensus of people that have read it and rated it on Goodreads. So, you'll see that most of them I do kind of agree with the rating, the average rating. I think that for the most part, on Goodreads, the issue tends to be not so much that people are too harsh on books, but that people are tend to be really generous on books instead. Like they really tend. Sometimes people give 4 stars when they really would want to give it two, or sometimes people absolutely hate everything about a book and give it 3 stars or something. For the most part, I think people are hesitant to use all of the stars and instead use 4 or 3 stars to give a fully negative review. So the lowest rated among the books that I have read is 120 Days of Sodom by Marquis de Sade. The average rating on Goodreads is 3.12 and I give it 2 stars. So it makes sense. Obviously that this has really mixed feelings about it. To be honest, maybe even 3 stars is a little generous because looking back, I like to think that I gave it a pretty fair review and that I started reading it with a pretty open mind, thinking that I might actually really like it despite everything. But honestly, I think it's a little too highly rated, probably because it's a classic or at least it's a really old book and people really want to give those books the benefit of the doubt. And I think that in this case, it really is not a classic, it's just an old book. It doesn't really have many interesting things in terms of depth or the writing style, the characters, the plot. Anything is really that special when you really look at it, I think, in literary terms. So I do think it deserves 3.12 or even less. The second one is Ven, which would mean something like come here or something, by Jane Taylor. I read it in Spanish for a class, but um, it is, I think it was originally written in Dutch or something, but I'm pretty sure it's European. I give it 2 stars again. And I think that the issues some people had based on the reviews that I saw that were negative is that it's not really a novel. It's just a sort of essay on the ethics of art, and in my opinion, it is sort of a half-assed essay. This story is basically about an editor that is working on a novel that is expected to become a bestseller and make him millions of money and everything. But then a woman comes to visit him and tells him that he can't publish that story because that story is essentially based on her being raped as a sort of terrorist measure, with a sort of political intention. And so the editor, basically the whole story, pretty much he's thinking about whether he should publish it or not. And, this is basically a spoiler and everything. But at the end, there's really no conclusion or anything of the sort, which is kind of pointless if you think about it. Even whether in a novel or in an essay way, it's kind of lazy and pointless because what is the point of all of this if you're not going to really have any conclusion or you're not going to have a real ending? I think it's kind of lazy sometimes to have open endings like that. They can work, but in the case of this fictionalized essays have conclusions. That's it's kind of point. You propose something, you have arguments, and then you go to the point. And there is no point in this one. It's just a story. Well, it can barely call a story again. It's just there's no real character development. There's really nothing, not a lot to be said about this story. So I think it deserves even less again than 3.22. Number 3 is Ghost at a Watchman by Harper Lee. You already know the story behind this one and how controversial it is and everything. I give it 2 stars again, and I don't really exactly remember why I give it 2 stars as opposed to just giving it one, because I can't really think of any one thing that I enjoyed from this book. Of course, I know it wasn't even meant to be published in the first place, and that's probably why I didn't like it that much, but I was curious, so I wanted to read it, and the fact that it was so depressing for no reason was kind of bad enough, but there was also that really, really strange and honestly not very good message about her scout learning to accept her father's views, and it just goes against everything that you think To Kill a Mockingbird was supposed to be about. So it is a terrible thing to read, especially if you have read To Kill a Mockingbird. Heart of Darkness is the next one, number 4, by Joseph Conrad, as you probably have heard of it. It has on average 3.42 stars. And on my review that I eventually deleted, I gave it 3.5 stars. I have mentioned this before, but I deleted it because I thought I really didn't have that much to say about it in terms of depth. I could just talk about the writing style and the characters, and I thought those were good. The characters were interesting, the writing style was great, but based on the plot, I just really didn't know what I really could take from it just based on the book itself, because I read and heard some people's reviews and I understood where they were coming from, but I myself couldn't really see my own interpretation, couldn't really make out an interpretation of my own just based on what happened in the book itself. So based on that, I think that 3.5 stars is perfect because it has really good things about it. It's well written, but at the same time, I wouldn't feel right having 4 stars on this book because I didn't really feel like I got it. So I think 3.5 stars is pretty good, and 3.4 to 2 is obviously really close to that. So I do agree with that one. Here's where it gets kind of weird. Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller and Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Those two have 3.68 stars on average on Goodreads. And that means they are the 5th and 6th lowest rated novels that I have read. I think that people people have valid reasons to not like these books. I'm gonna start with Tropic of Cancer. People don't like it based on the reviews that I have seen because they just I guess they don't like the fact that it doesn't have a plot, and probably the fact that the main character is kind of an asshole, which is true. I mean, he is, and it definitely doesn't have much of a plot. But I think it's pretty interesting as a novel anyway. I don't think it needs the structure of a usual novel to be an interesting one, because it's still sort of a diary entry kind of structure, and I think it does it well. The main character, again, he's not easy to love, but he has interesting things to say and he still feels like a real person. So to me, I do think it's a pretty good novel that you can take things from. So I give 4 stars, which is not too far from being 3.6, but it is higher than the average rating, which is pretty rare for me. Most of the ratings that I have given on Goodreads have been either a bit lower or significantly lower than the average rating. So for me to have to rate a book in a way that is higher than the average rating is pretty rare. So the 6th one, like I mentioned, is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Based on the reviews, again, some people obviously, well, I agree with a certain part of it. The fact that obviously these kids that the book is about don't really represent humanity and shouldn't have to be made to represent humanity, because there's such a specific part of the population that there's no reason why we would take their fictional story as some sort of affirmation of what human nature is. I feel a similar way about how people talk about the Stanford experiment and how it teaches us about human nature, when it really just teaches you about the attitudes of this very specific group of people who are really all just mostly, from what I remember, mostly white American men from this very specific school that is also implies a certain level of implies a certain socioeconomic group and everything. So there's such a specific group of people that it would be really strange to pretend that these people somehow are the default and represent all of humanity. But at the same time, I don't think that it really applies for this book in order to review it, because I don't really remember. I probably read the book maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but I don't think there was anything in the book that presented itself as if it was meant to represent all of humanity. Of course, sometimes children are used symbolically to represent some sort of nature of people in general, as if, children are, of course, haven't really been socialized. So sometimes they behave in ways in which we take to mean a sort of wilder version of adults, or how adults would be if they were just a little bit less civilized or something of the sort. But truly, even though I do get that logic with children, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that specific children or even a specific group of children represent humans or some sort of hypothetical state of humans. However, as I was saying, I don't think that the book presents itself as if we were meant to be taking those children to represent humanity. I mean, they're just characters, and characters are, of course, supposed to symbolically represent real people, but they're not supposed to represent humanity as a whole, or at least that's never been something that I have taken from any other novel or anything fictional before. So I don't think it's really a problem of the book itself that people sometimes take it to mean, I think erroneously and mistakenly take it to mean, oh, this is human nature, but rather it's a problem with people and how they interpret this book. So I think this book, in terms of how it's written, is actually pretty good. I mean, I remember thinking that the first third of the book was really, really boring, but after that it was pretty great, and so I gave it 4 stars. But really, most of the reviews were talking about that specific aspect, the interpretation of the book, and not really the book itself. So again, that's another thing that I kinda find to be a flaw or an issue. When people talk about reviews, sometimes people forget to keep it to the book itself and not essentially reviewing other people's interpretation or take on it. Those are the lowest rated on Goodreads books that I have read, and that's what I think of them. I think it would be probably more contrasting or more interesting to have a version of this where I actually talk about the highest rated books that I have read or that are on my TBR currently, but then I, read them, of course, and what I think of them and whether I think they really do deserve that high rating. Because really, these aren't the lowest rated books that I have read. I have a lot of 1 stars and 1.5s that actually have really high ratings, like 4.5. So these are actually not even among the lowest rated by me. So it's pretty interesting. I think that that's partly because they're kind of unconventional. In the case of some, I think it's because they're kind of unconventional in terms of their structure and stuff like that. And in terms of others, I think that it's just because they're not popular enough to have enough of a following that of people that really like them. Obviously, popular books lend themselves to more hate, but also they tend to have a very strong defensive fan group, fandom, so it kind of evens itself out. But in the case of less popular books, sometimes they are more, I guess, more justly rated, because people aren't necessarily very personally defensive about them because they don't necessarily have a strong attachment to them. Just obviously just an idea that I have, but I don't really, it's just something that I'm speculating. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this video, and I'll see you in the next one.